a new era because the most profound event in human history is going to take place. Nothing else comes close. As the way I define it, not even the birth of Jesus or any of the great avatars matches this in terms of its immediacy, its power, its potency. Not that those weren't profound, and they were. But this is the ultimate profound event, and you are going to be here for it. You have the great fortune of being alive for this. If you had picked out 20,000 lifetimes, that would be your odds of being alive at this time. And it's going to happen whether you like it or not, and you'd simply have to decide how you're going to engage it as we go into it and as we get past it. And it starts, in a sense, I'll start my approach to this way. In the 20th century, the most powerful icon, the most powerful image, without fail, nothing comes close, is this image. Nothing comes close. This is as Jungian architecturally as it gets. Everyone that are in the baby boomer generation like myself had this in their minds from virtually the day they were born, and it has been there ever since. It has been affecting us in uncountable ways that have yet to be measured. No one has even begun to try to understand the psychological implications and impact of this image and all that it represented. A whole planet of people lived their life under a Damocles sword. It didn't simply pose their own death to them, but rather the death of species itself. Total annihilation, extinction. And badly, too. It wouldn't be like taking a little alcohol and second all. This would be a bad way to go. And so, what happened in 1947 is that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists created a clock called the Doomsday Clock. And they made midnight on that clock nuclear war. He did this so that they could impress the press and the people with whether we're getting closer or further away, and just try to raise the public awareness about that problem, so that hopefully we wouldn't use that weapon again. But we did use it. Fact is that in the human history, the human beings have never, ever, ever created a weapon that they didn't use. It's something you want to keep in mind. There are no exceptions. The doomsday clock was moved closer or further from midnight. It was neutral at 15 minutes. In 1947, they started at 7 minutes to midnight, and the closest it got was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Berlin Wall crisis, the Berlin crisis, the airlift and so forth. It got close again during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then toward the end, as you can see, they moved it almost back to neutral. This is all the way in 91, and there's a reason for that. And then, amazingly, it started moving towards midnight. A lot of people aren't paying attention to that, though. The reason that it was moved so far away from midnight at that time was this. After 44 years of living under that Damocles sword, finally the great ideological conflict between the West and the East, the capitalists and the communists, came to an end. It began in '89 with the Berlin Wall, the freeing of that, East Germany. And then by '91, it had expanded through a very complex process to the dissolution of the Soviet Empire into 14 republics and the detargeting of the Soviet missiles, or the Russian missiles at that point, on the United States. A small article appeared in the Washington Post late in 1991. And so a new era was about to begin. An era of peace, an era of less weapons, more cooperation, stronger United Nations, solving our problems through appropriate means. Everybody had been waiting a long time. Many had never lived to see the day come, but it was all to happen. Of course, we know that it didn't. But something else began to happen, right? And this something is what launched the era that we're in relative to the field that I am in. Because prior to, right, the end of the Cold War, we were in the era of the UFO. And the UFO era went from 1947 to 1991. I'm not going to get into it. I think most of you know quite a bit about it, right? And in that time, citizen scientists, working very hard, proved beyond a doubt that there is an extraterrestrial presence engaging the planet. In fact, it was proven as early as the mid-50s. Locked down, solid. After that, they just piled proof upon proof. So let's be clear. The presence of extraterrestrials engaging the planet, at least minimally by being in the skies, is an absolute certainty. 100% unadulterated certainty. Anybody that tells you different is simply mistaken. Be nice to them, move on. Right? But that era could only, well, what happened in that era happened. And at some point we needed to move on, and that happened when the Cold War ended. And the reason for that is these. Very simply, the thousands of people inside the governments and agencies that intersected UFO and ET during that period, from 47 to 91, were good and honest people, and they had agreements and oaths and classifications and all kinds of restraints that required them to, for national security purposes, keep their mouth shut and take the issue to the grave, and they did. They may have had some misgivings, but they were good people, and they honored their agreements. All right? And the principal overriding, I think, psychological motivation for being that consistent, and again, thousands of people held on to their agreements, was the Cold War and the nuclear standoff. Because whether they were told or not, they knew that if one day they woke up maybe in a little funky frame of mind and decided to head on down to the New York Times with a whole bunch of photographs and documents and other things which confirm what they were involved in and announce the extraterrestrial presence, and the New York Times jumped on that baby and put it out, and lo and behold, it's 1956, 62, whatever. They, given the situation, right, the fact that we were on a few minutes' notice from being essentially annihilated, wiped off the face of the earth, and we'd already had, well, during that period, about a half a dozen near-nuclear wars, some you know about, some you don't, that, yeah, it could add a somewhat destabilizing factor into an already difficult situation, and as a result, somebody would miscalculate, launch the missiles, and end civilization. And, of course, that on their resume. So they would, you know, later on go in for a job, and they'd be looking down there, and they'd say, well, you've got some fine college background in the military there. It's very good, great ratings. Okay, well, I see here that you shot your mouth off and ended civilization. That's a tough one. I'll tell you what, come back in about 4 or 5 lifetimes, and we'll see what we can do, all right? So they kept their mouth shut. But when the Cold War ended, many of the retired in that genre decided that it wasn't really necessary for them to keep silent. They started coming forward, and the process of them coming forward has been driving the era that we're in now. The UFO era ends in 1991. We didn't know it then. This is retroactively. This is 2020 hindsight, but that's the way history is carved up. That era ends, and a new era begins. In the early days, it was called the politics of UFOs. I may have coined that phrase, doesn't really matter. It's a perfect phrase because it bridges the two eras. It's got the UFO, it's got the politics. But UFO ultimately does have to go. I knew that early on, and so not too long down the line, it morphed into politics of disclosure. I don't know who were using disclosure with a big D. Greer, myself, others. Again, credit can't be assigned. Politics of disclosure was the next bridge. Disclosure is a fairly narrow thing, but it definitely takes us away from UFO into something that's more relevant. What is it? You've probably heard about it. It has a capital D, and it has a very simple definition. Nothing more and nothing less, all right? And that definition is the formal acknowledgement by the governments of nations of the extraterrestrial presence engaging the human race and the planet Earth. Somebody goes on TV, probably with a little gun camera footage from some chase planes. You have a little press conference, and they say, yes, ETs are here. We knew it. We didn't tell you then. National security reasons. We're telling you now. Don't be worried. That's it. It's over. Of course, it will ripple around the world in about 10 minutes, explode on the internet, go on television, and you'll be glued to your sets for weeks. But that disclosure occurs in the first minute. And politics of disclosure is what was front and center and still is in what is now called exopolitics. This is the era of exopolitics, the exopolitic era. New lexicon in order to shed the ghetto lexicon put upon us by the state during what was the most profound and accomplished propaganda campaign in the history of humankind. It was absolutely brilliant. Surpassed what the Nazis did between 30 and 44, what the Soviets did between 1918 and 1991. It was unbelievable propaganda effort, the highest caliber, because they were able to convince millions of people in open state with media everywhere convince the press, convince the politicians and the money people and the clergy and everyone else that something that was flying around and being seen all over the world and interacting with tens of thousands of human beings wasn't in fact taking place. And the people bought it and stuck with it for 6 decades. The effort went into it was extraordinary. They spent a ton of money and they succeeded. Exopolitics is the current definition that I wrote up a while ago, and I've been